Hi, I'm Earl Taylor, Chief Knowledge Officer at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, MSI helps marketers become better marketers. Our business and academic thought leaders collaborate to create new marketing knowledge, which we share in a variety of ways. And one of the most popular is our online Lunch Lecture series. Those of you attending today represent many business sectors such as insurance, entertainment, technology, CPG, and more, as well as MSI members such as Ford, Colgate, Palmolive, American Express, Dell, and others. We're glad to have you with us. So we're delighted to welcome you to learn more about marketing digital versus physical goods. Now, before we begin, I'd like to point to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have during the presentation. We'll get to the questions and have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. Carey Morewedge is Professor of Marketing and Everett W. Lord Distinguished Faculty Scholar at the Boston University Questrom School of Business. His research examines how higher-order cognitive processes such as memory, attention, and comparison influence human judgment and decision-making. He's published over 40 articles in top peer-reviewed journals such as Science, Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing Research, and others. He's also been named a top 40 under 40 most outstanding MBA professors by Poets and Quants. And he recently won an award for the most theoretically innovative article of the year from the Society of Personality and Social Psychology. Carey received his MA and PhDs in social psychology from Harvard. And he's going to be talking to us today about why digital goods are valued less than physical goods. So Carey, take it away.
Hi, Earl. Thanks for having me, and thanks for joining in on this afternoon. It's a bit rainy here in Boston, but I'm glad you can join us, and I hope you're having great weather wherever you are. Today, I'm going to be talking about why digital goods are valued less than physical goods. And this work is with a former student of mine, Ozgun Adesoy, who's a postdoc at the University of Basel. So, digital goods have been around for a long time. As early as the 60s, NASA used digital photographs to send pictures of the moon to Earth, and they've been available to science and industry. But it wasn't really until the 1990s that digital cameras took off and became commercially viable. As of now, digital photographs are taken more often than print photographs, and we've seen similar advances in technology that have given rise to the digitization of many other consumer goods, from movies to magazines to newspapers to music and books. Digital goods are proliferated in part due to their many advantages over their physical counterparts. So a decade ago, if I went to the beach, taking 3 books would be a hassle. But today I can buy, store, and choose which of 1,000 books to read on my phone or tablet, whether I'm at the beach, on the plane, or waiting in the doctor's office. Digital goods are also advantageous because they're rarely lost or damaged. My toddler could throw my phone in Boston Harbor, but the pictures, movies, books, songs, and videos it contains and that I treasure are all backed up in the cloud and can be fully recoverable. Digital goods don't only benefit consumers, but they also benefit society. So they have a fraction of the environmental impact of comparable physical goods. But despite these and many other kinds of advantages of digital goods relative to their physical counterparts, consumers seem to not appreciate digital goods. They haven't replaced physical goods in the hearts and homes and wallets of consumers. So consider the market for books, for example. Ebooks are now fairly stable in terms of sales, but they've not replaced the consumer appetite for physical books. So you see about 1 out of 4 books in terms of sales is an ebook, 3 out of 4 is a print book. If you look at the average American who reads about 4 books a year, at least 3 of those books are physical and not digital. And if we look at the whole market and see what consumers are actually reading, we can see that the majority of consumers still only read print books, whereas only 6% of consumers have completely given up the print format and gone entirely digital. Books aren't a unique case. The circulation of print magazines has remained constant since 2008 at about 7,000 titles per year. You can also see similar trends in terms of Blu-ray and DVDs. And in the realm of music, demand for vinyl is even appearing to be on the rise. And even with consumers now taking over 1 trillion digital photographs every year, they're still printing as many as 35 billion of those photographs, leading many people to call right now the golden age of printed photography. So we
Carey?
identify, yes?
Sorry, are you sharing your slides?
I am.
Okay, I hope the audience is seeing them. We're not seeing them here.
Okay.
Do you want to try hitting the share again?
Sure.
Awesome.
There we go. Great. I think the voiceover was very clear thus far, but this will help.
Sure.
So go ahead and continue then. Thanks.
Okay, so we identify a driver of this paradox in our work. We find that consumers do seem to value digital goods less than comparable physical goods. And it's not because of physical goods being more unique or having lower production or having higher production costs or having a higher market value or having a greater resale value or being more permanent or being more pleasurable to consume. But rather we find that the materiality of physical goods makes them easier for people to touch, manipulate, and interact with than digital goods. That feeling of being able to touch and control those goods increases the perception that one controls physical relative to digital goods. And when people feel like they can control a thing, that leads them to feel like they have psychological ownership for it. The feeling that...
Carey?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt again. It looks like the display is mainly showing the notes part of the slides rather than the slide. Can you maximize the slide?
Sure.
Yeah. Because you got a cute picture there. We don't want to miss that one.
Okay, now I can't see the screen. Let's see.
There you go. And just go to slide mode. That'll be perfect. Thanks.
Sure, is that working now?
Yep.
Perfect.
Okay.
Didn't want to miss that one.
Sure. So this feeling of psychological ownership, you could think of as a feeling that something's mine. So this book or this car or this home is something that's mine that I own and I control. And we know from work on the endowment effect that this feeling of psychological ownership also enhances the value of a good. So feeling that a home is yours leads you to value it more than if you didn't own it. Feeling that a book is yours makes you feel like you own it, value it more than if you didn't own it. And so to summarize our model, we're suggesting that consumers, for physical relative to digital goods, they're more likely to feel greater control for physical than digital goods. They're more likely to feel psychological ownership for physical than digital goods. And thus they're more likely to value physical more than digital goods, even if they're the same functional format and they might be perfect substitutes in terms of their consumption value. So I'm going to first show you a field study where we tested the basic assumption that we're making here, that consumers value physical goods more than digital goods in an empirical experiment. And so what we did was we stopped tourists who were visiting Old North Church, which is the origin of Paul Revere's ride in Boston. And we dressed a research assistant as Paul Revere in historical costume. And we offered tourists to have a photograph with Paul Revere. And as a thanks for the photograph, we asked them to make a donation to the historical society that maintained the church. And we used what's called a pay what you want paradigm. So we gave them the photograph and we said they could pay whatever they'd like to, including zero. So what we did was we measured how much consumers donated after we took the photograph, which was either physical, it was a print photograph that was an instant photograph, or an ostensibly better digital photograph that we took on a high resolution smartphone. Then consumers, after we took the photograph while it was developing or while we emailed it to them, paid whatever they wanted to as a donation for the photograph to the Historical Society. And then after they made this donation, we recorded it, and we also asked them to estimate how much they thought it would cost to make this kind of photograph as well. So how much it would cost for us per photograph to hire the RA to come down and spend our time there, and also for the cost of the photograph itself and materials. And so what we found was that although ostensibly the digital photograph was something that you could share with more people, that was a higher quality, The consumers seem to, or the tourists in this case, seem to be willing to pay more for the physical photograph than the digital photograph. So we found on average, they donated about $3.39 to the Historical Society for the physical photograph, whereas they only donated about $2.29 for the digital photograph. And you can see here that there's many more people paying zero or nothing in the digital than the physical case. And this even controls for when we ask them about their production costs of the photograph. So you might think that, well, a digital photograph costs nothing to take, so consumers might think it's the marginal cost of the photograph is lower. Even when we control for that difference, we still see a significant difference between the valuation for the donations for the physical and digital photograph. And you can see with other kinds of metrics like medians, we see that people, the median amount donated was about $3 in the physical case and about $1 in the digital case. So next we wanted to see the next sort of step of our model, whether or not people feel more ownership for physical than digital goods, and if that difference in ownership explains the greater value they ascribe to physical than digital goods. And so we used two more sort of commonly sold goods, a movie and a book. So we had consumers tell us how much they'd be willing to pay for either a digital or physical copy of a movie or a book. So the movie we used was The Dark Knight, and the book we used was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And then afterwards, we asked them the extent to which they would feel like they had psychological ownership for either the book or the movie, the extent to which they felt like it would be permanent or long-lasting, and also their consumption utility of either the digital or physical book. So these were all between subjects, and people didn't know about the other good, and they didn't know about the other format. And so this could tell us whether or not this difference in willingness to pay, or how much people are valuing the physical relative to the digital good, is being driven by differences in the feeling that it's mine, differences in the feeling that it's permanent, or how much you enjoy watching the movie or reading the book. So we find that consumers think that digital and physical goods offer similar kinds of consumption utility. So in other words, consumers thought that they would enjoy watching the movie as much as if it was in a digital or physical format, or as much as if it was on a Kindle or in a paperback. But they were still willing to pay more for both the physical copy of the movie and book than the digital copy. And so what we did find in this case was that consumers said that they would feel more psychological ownership for both the physical than the digital movie and book. And they also did say that there was a difference in the permanence, but that didn't seem to explain the relationship. So if we do parallel mediation analysis, we can find that the degree to which consumers felt greater psychological ownership for physical than digital goods explained their greater willingness to pay for physical than digital goods. But the difference in permanence between physical and digital didn't explain the difference in value. So one question you might have is, well, maybe it's something about signaling. So I have books on my shelf and they signal to other people all the kinds of stimulating intellectual things that I've read. Or I might have a DVD library and that signals sort of my taste in films to other people. So maybe there's something about physical goods that's not really something that I enjoy, but something that I use to broadcast something about my identity. And so our next study looked at this question about signal value by asking consumers how much they'd be willing to pay for highbrow and lowbrow goods. So highbrow goods could be something that you would think of as being culturally sophisticated, whereas lowbrow goods would be something that would be more of a guilty pleasure. And so to do this, we asked consumers to tell us how much they'd be willing to pay for one book and one movie in either a digital or physical format. And for the highbrow book and movie, we used Schindler's List and Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. And for the lowbrow physical and digital books and movies, we used Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Breaking Dawn, which is the first in the series of the Twilight books. And what we found in our analyses was that across both books and movies, consumers were willing to pay more for a physical copy of either the book or the movie than a digital copy, whether the movie was highbrow or lowbrow. So consumers were willing to pay more for highbrow goods than lowbrow goods, but we didn't see that this difference between the cultural sophistication of the book or the movie changed the valuation that consumers experienced for physical relative to digital goods. So it's not so much that I want to broadcast something about what I've read or what I've watched or my tastes to other people. It seems to be something driven more about psychological ownership. To probe that ownership question, we next did a couple experiments where we looked at cases in which ownership is turned on or off or made more or less important. And so one question about ownership is, we feel more ownership for things that we own that are relevant to our identity or towards our sense of who we are. So for example, you might feel like a tote bag that displays some kind of meaningful group with which you're affiliated might give you, you might feel like you have a stronger sense of ownership for that than something that's more generic. And so we use this question of identity relevance as a lever in which to look at psychological ownership and its influence on this difference in value. So in this third experiment, what we did was we asked people, or the fourth experiment, we asked people to rank the identity relevance, so how much they were a fan of a series of movies, Star Wars, relative to several other kinds of movie series like Rocky, Pirates of the Caribbean, Step Up, Fast and Furious, the Die Hard films, Sex and the City, James Bond, Halloween, and the Godfather movies. And once we identified what the relative rank of Star Wars was compared to these other kinds of series of movies, we asked them also their willingness to purchase a copy of The Empire Strikes Back in either physical or digital format at $15.99. And so here the price of the movie was held constant, and we asked them simply, how likely would you be to buy either a digital copy of the film or a physical copy of the film? And people only knew about one of the two copies. And what we found was that the identity relevance of Star Wars, so how much Star Wars is important to me as a fan or a sense of my identity, seemed to moderate this difference between physical and digital goods. So we found that the more people viewed Star Wars as being relevant to their identity, the more they felt like they were a fan, the more likely they were to prefer a physical to a digital copy. So consumers who really loved Star Wars were much more likely to buy a physical copy of The Empire Strikes Back than a digital copy of The Empire Strikes Back. Consumers who viewed Star Wars as being similar in terms of how much they were a fan for it as other films were indifferent between the physical and digital versions of the films. Another question that we looked at regarding ownership is this question of expected ownership. So some very interesting work in behavioral economics has shown that when people don't expect to continue to own something in the future, like if you're buying something to sell it, like a baseball card trader, you're less likely to show these kinds of endowment effects. So professional card traders are less likely to show endowment effects for sports memorabilia than amateurs. And also people who feel like they're unlikely to get something in the future are less likely to show an endowment effect for it than people who believe it will be theirs. And to this end, we asked undergraduate business majors to imagine they're going to acquire a textbook for a course that they're going to take, and it was in its last year of its current edition, so it would have no resale value when the course is over. And then we asked them to imagine how much they'd be willing to pay to either purchase a physical or digital copy of the book, or to rent a physical or digital copy of the book. So notice in the case of purchasing the physical or digital copy, you'd expect to own it after the course is over, whereas in the case of the rental of the physical or digital copy, you'd have to give it back. And so you should feel less psychological ownership for it. And so what we expected was that we'd see a bigger difference between physical and digital goods valuation when people expected to own the textbook than when people simply expected to rent the textbook. And that's what we found. So as you can see, people were willing to pay the same amount to rent or buy a digital copy of the course textbook, whereas they were willing to pay more to buy a physical copy of the course textbook than to rent it, even though it was in its last year of that edition. And you can see even statistically, there was no difference between the rental conditions for the physical and digital textbooks. I think this is really interesting, in particular for companies that are built on a platform model of streaming. And you could think in this case, it does seem that there's not added value for offering physical formats. So for a long time, Netflix, for example, offered both streaming and DVDs. And you could think that some consumers might prefer physical copies. Well, our research suggests that people don't seem to value physical copies more than digital copies when they expect to return the good. So next, we tested the third stage of our model, whether or not differences in perceived control for physical versus digital goods underlies this difference in ownership and difference in value. And so what we did here was we asked people how much they'd be willing to pay for a new book by their favorite author. We asked them to estimate its production cost and retail price. And then we asked them the extent to which they would feel psychological ownership for the book if they purchased it. And also we asked them about their need for control. And need for control is a psychological construct that leads people to feel like they need to have more control over their environment. And we found in this case that people, again, were willing to pay more for the physical than digital copy of the book. We looked whether or not people who were higher in need for control would be more likely to show this difference than people who are lower in need for control. And so I think this Calvin and Hobbes strip gives us a nice insight into what need for control is. And what we found is when we measured need for control, we found that moderated the effect of physical versus digital format on how much people felt psychological ownership for a good and also how much they're willing to pay for it. So people had a higher need for control over their environment, were more likely to feel more ownership for physical than digital goods, and also to value physical than digital goods more, whereas people who are lower in need for control were less likely to show a difference in terms of how much they felt like they owned physical and digital copies of a book, and also were less likely to show differences in how much they valued the physical and digital copies of the book. So I've shown you some evidence that for physical goods relative to digital goods, consumers feel greater perceived control for those physical than digital goods. That leads them to feel greater psychological ownership for physical relative to digital goods, and that leads them to value physical goods more than similar digital goods. So across different studies, we find in these pay what you want, willingness to pay, and purchase intention measures, consumers are valuing digital goods less than their physical substitutes. This seems to be mediated by psychological ownership, which seems to be the underlying process, as it's also moderated by its boundaries, like buying versus renting, and how relevant the good is to our identity. And this seems to demonstrate that psychological ownership is also influenced by features of goods, rather than just something that's inherent in the consumer. So here we're looking at a feature of a good that's changing how much people feel like they own it or it's mine. So we think there's some interesting ways for firms to think about this and to respond and preserve the value that might be lost when they're digitizing different kinds of goods. So one kind of technique that many firms have designed is this idea of relied on is skeuomorphism. So taking digital goods and presenting them in a way that makes them have the similar cues as those goods would have in a physical format. So you could think about iBooks arranges many of the books available to its users in terms of a shelf model. So people can browse through digital titles as if they were looking on a physical shelf of books. You can think also that customization, so mass customization, is one way to make consumers feel like they have more control over a digital good. So for example, Squarespace and many kinds of other firms will offer consumers ways to customize goods, whether it's a website or a car or a toy for their child, that makes it feel like it's something that they've made and something that is something over which they have control. Another way to give consumers an increased sense of control and ownership are through things like gesture and touch interfaces. So touching a tablet or touching different kinds of interfaces like Levi's new jacket can give consumers a sense of greater psychological ownership for different kinds of goods and seems to increase the value that they're ascribed. And we think that there's also some really kinds of interesting questions that this research raises for firms about sort of future models of ownership and how consumers interact with them. So some work that we're doing right now is focused on the question of digital piracy. And so you can see that consumers are much more likely to engage in digital piracy than comparable physical theft. So whereas about 9% of Americans shoplifted in their lifetime, 32% report watching a pirated video last year. And so most of the work on piracy in this case has been looking at questions about who can afford these goods, or how likely you are to get caught, or is there something unique about a person? But people have started to think about this difference between digital and physical goods. For example, the Intellectual Property Office of Singapore ran a campaign in 2004 that tried to explicitly make the comparison between pirating video and pirating physical film. And so here they're saying you wouldn't steal a movie or you wouldn't steal a car. Why would you download these kinds of goods? So these prevailing explanations, again, have focused on things like pricing. So many people can't afford the physical copies or the digital copies, and so they'll download them. Social norms, that it's more acceptable to pirate than to steal a physical copy. Deterrence risk, that you're more likely to be caught for stealing a digital than a physical copy, or differences in terms of demography or personality, like millennials are more likely to be sort of stimulus, sensation seeking. But what we suggest is that if we perceive others to have weaker ownership of digital goods than physical goods, perhaps the theft of digital goods may be perceived to incur less harm. So in other words, if I don't really feel like you own a digital copy of your film, HBO, right, I might feel less bad about downloading Game of Thrones than stealing a physical copy of the DVD. And so with this decreased perception of harm to the owner, people may feel like stealing those goods, those digital goods, might be less morally blameworthy or unethical. And so we tested this in a number of studies where we looked at the theft of goods from different categories like art and books, even money, so digital versus physical currency, games, magazines, movies, music, newspapers, photographs, and tools. And for these cases, we asked people to compare physical and digital substitutes for each of these categories with regards to how frequently people steal them, so as a measure of social norms, how likely we were to get caught, what the monetary loss would be to the owner, how morally blameworthy the theft of that good is, and what would be an appropriate fine. And what we find is that for physical relative to digital goods, people say that their theft is not always equally frequent. Their theft is not always more frequent for digital goods than physical goods, but you're more likely to get caught for stealing a physical good. There's more monetary loss to the owner. It's more blameworthy, and they deemed higher fines to be appropriate. You can see this is true across for the deterrence risk, how much people feel like is lost by the owner, how blameworthy it is, and the fines awarded. It's true for every single category that we looked at. The only case where people didn't think physical was more than digital was how often these things are being stolen. And what we find, though, that's really interesting is when you control for social norms and the likelihood of being caught, and also how costly these things are to owners, the immorality of stealing digital goods relative to physical goods seems to be a pretty strong predictor of how much people are awarding fines. So people are more likely to award larger fines for the theft of physical goods relative to digital goods, the more immoral they think it is to steal a physical good relative to a digital good, even when we control for these other kinds of factors. And so we started digging a little bit more into this question of harm. Is this perception of physical goods being more immoral to steal because people think that the theft of a physical good is harming someone, the owner, more than the theft of a comparable digital good? And to that, we again asked people to evaluate the theft of 10 categories of goods. So everything from art to currency to games, tools, books, and movies. And we asked people for each of these categories of goods, how much does the owner feel like it's theirs? So what's the psychological ownership experienced by the owner? How much harm is inflicted by the theft of that good to the owner? So how affected are they by the theft of that good? And what's the moral blameworthiness of stealing these different kinds of goods? And what we find here is that for every category, people believe that owners feel more psychological ownership for the digital version of the good for the physical version of the good than the digital version of good. They're more harmed by the physical good than the digital good, and it's more morally blameworthy to steal the physical good than the digital good. And we find that this difference in psychological ownership, I feel like other people have more ownership claims or feelings towards physical than digital goods, leads people to see the theft of physical goods as causing more harm than the theft of comparable digital goods, and to view them as being their theft to be more morally blameworthy. And last, we find here in this case that this moral blameworthiness might influence how much damage, what are the appropriate damages that should be awarded for these different kinds of theft. So again, we asked people to evaluate these 10 categories, the extent to which people felt psychological ownership for the goods that they owned in each of these categories, how morally blameworthy it was to steal each of these things, and also what were appropriate damages. And you can see, again here, we replicate the previous research where we find that people feel the owners have more psychological ownership for physical than digital goods. It's more blameworthy to steal physical than digital goods, so it's more morally wrong. And also they award higher damages for the theft of physical than digital goods. Notice this is true even for things like currency, where it's analogous whether or not cash is stolen out of your bank account or safe deposit box, or cash is stolen digitally from your account. And here we see that this difference in psychological ownership is making, so the feeling that other people have greater ownership claims to physical than digital goods makes the theft of the physical goods more blameworthy, and makes people award higher damages for the theft of physical than digital goods. So I think the piracy work that we're doing is really interesting, and I'm happy to tell you when we find more about sort of its extensions and what are other kinds of drivers. We think there's some other kinds of interesting implications as well here. So many of the goods that we're consuming now are moving from more material kinds of goods to experiential goods. So for example, where people used to buy a car, now often many people are shifting towards using ride-sharing services where they purchase the ride or the use of the service from a platform like Uber. And so many of the kinds of goods that consumers used to own, whether it be these cars or movies and books, they're now streaming or purchasing on demand from firms and retailers. It's possible that as these goods become more experiential, they become more similar to these kinds of digital goods. So as we purchase a ride or we stream a good, or we rent a home instead of purchasing a second home, we view these kinds of on-access types of goods as being things that we don't really own. And so we may have less value for them. We may treat them more poorly than we would something that we own as well. And another interesting question that this research raises is this question of complementarity. So now there are many cases where digital and physical goods are complements in the sense that I can purchase a photograph, a printer for my photographs. I can take a digital photograph and decide what to print in physical form. How are consumers making these kinds of decisions about what should stay digital and what should stay physical? Or am I only printing the most valuable photographs, for example? Do I feel like I need to have a physical version of something that's digital if I really value it? Is there a market for making physical some of these digital kinds of properties and goods? And last, we could think about the fungibility of ownership. As things become more and more digital and I'm using different kinds of devices to access them, is ownership declining in the population in general? Do people feel less ownership for all of the things that are theirs? Or do we see ownership coalescing towards the use of the particular objects that we use to interact with these kinds of goods? So for example, do I feel like stronger ownership for my phone now than I did when all of my music and books were more physical? So as my music collection and my collection of books becomes increasingly digitized, do I feel more ownership for the means through which I access it? So my phone or tablet or computer. And so thanks for listening to me. If you'd like to hear more about this kind of work, we have one paper published in the Journal of Consumer Research, and we have some more research underway. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And I also regularly talk about this stuff online as well.
Thanks very much, Carey. That was great. Covered a lot of material and a lot of really thought-provoking findings. I really appreciate the way you elaborated some of the possible implications at the end. I was going to ask, almost one of the first questions that occurred to me was, is this a kind of a generational thing? Have you been able to study different age groups or different demographic segments to see if some are more or less attached to the physical objects. You seem to imply towards the end here that there may be the fungibility of ownership may be a kind of a generational thing, that people grew up with the sharing economy may not be as wedded to their physical objects. And I'm just curious if you have some research or some intuitions about that.
Well, that's a great question, and that's certainly something that we thought about originally. We did look in our paper at age effects. So some of the experiments that we ran, for example, with tourists and online had pretty diverse samples with regards to age, and we don't find age effects there. So we find that both younger and older consumers seem to show this difference. And we even found this difference to be pretty stark amongst our undergraduate population, who might be the kind of consumers who might be closest to people who are more sort of digital natives in that sense.
That's a good point. I want to remind the audience again that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions live. And as Carey indicated, I'm sure he'd love to hear from you at his email address if you have questions or issues that come up later. I want to come back to your early explanation in terms of the endowment effect. That seemed, when you tested a variety of alternative explanations, it really does seem to come down to that notion of the endowment effect and the sense of control that the physical object gives you. And, you know, one of the interesting phenomena has been that after the kind of initial enthusiasm for e-readers and e-books and things, that the physical book market has actually come back a bit and maybe even overtaken some of the digital books, which seemed at the time to be the wave of the future. So I'm just wondering, when you look at the variety of impacts, is it as, I don't want to say simple, but is it a consistent finding that the endowment effect seems to kind of trump other explanations? If so, that really becomes a very powerful lens to look at just about anything when we're trying to put together, you know, a product or a service for consumers. So maybe just speculate a little bit more about the relative power of the endowment effect.
Sure. I think there's lots of cases where a lot of our consumption is moving more towards what a lot of scholars in marketing would call liquid consumption. So where rather than owning a unique kind of physical object, we're often purchasing access rights to some kind of good or service. And what we're finding there is that the thinking of psychological ownership as a framework to interpret this kind of interpret the value that consumers ascribe to these goods may be very useful. So certainly there are differences in terms of market norms like pricing and market norms like things like production costs, for example. And we don't mean to say that consumers totally ignore these kinds of important constraints on the value of goods. But what we find in these kinds of cases is that we can moderate the difference between physical and digital by turning on and off things that are relevant for psychological ownership. So people seem to show a stronger preference for physical relative to digital when a good is something that they use or think about as being really relevant to their identity. So if it's something meaningful that says something about me as a scholar or as a parent or as a husband or as a fan, in these kinds of cases, people are more likely to show a stronger preference for physical relative to digital. We also see. That's great.
Go ahead.
We also see what's really interesting for people who are involved in more kinds of on-access goods is that people don't seem to discriminate between physical and digital. So if I feel like I'm going to rent something, right? So let's say that I'm running a guidebook company, right? And I only need a book for its instrumental value, or I'm going to rent something if I'm visiting a museum, the museum could either offer me a pamphlet or it could offer me an app that I could download onto my phone to use during the exhibit. So if the consumer is going to take that home with them and use it as a souvenir, certainly they might value the physical more than the digital copy. But if it's something that they're just going to use for that moment and then return afterwards, there doesn't seem to be a difference. And so when firms are trying to navigate the question of, does it make sense for me to offer both kinds of formats, you really have to think about whether or not consumers are going to retain that physical or digital copy later on, and how much it's going to matter to their sense of who they are or expressing that to other people.
That's great. One of the first questions that came in actually, I think, relates to what you were just saying, and that is, did the product type moderate the relationship between the psychological ownership and willingness to pay. And I think this maybe goes back to your comments about more experiential goods, but presumably there are some differences across different product categories about whether there is a sense of psychological ownership, and then in turn how that affects willingness to pay. So maybe restate kind of what that relationship is.
Sure. So we find across different kinds of products, like for example, in other work that we did that was pilot that wasn't published in this paper, we found similar kinds of effects for things like magazines. So for movies, magazines, books, pictures, it didn't seem to be so much a function of the product category that moderated the difference between physical and digital, but more about whether or not people expected to own it or if it was identity relevant, so something internal to the consumer. So I think that those kinds of questions about psychological ownership seem to be better predictors of the effect than the specific type of product itself. I see there's another really interesting question about physical and digital coupons. We haven't looked at that, and so that might be an interesting question about whether or not consumers many people sort of hold on to coupons a little bit longer than they should. Maybe consumers are more likely to hold on to a physical coupon than a digital coupon. They're more likely to redeem the digital coupon immediately. That's certainly a possible sort of prediction of this kind of work. But we see that these sort of psychological constructs better predict this difference than the sort of product category questions as well.
That's an important insight too, because it goes back to what struck me about your whole presentation is these are pretty powerful forces that generalize across a lot of different occasions and settings and types of products. So the nice thing about that from the manager's standpoint is you can, again, use that as kind of a lens. Imagine what is the level of psychological ownership, how do we enhance that, and what are the likely consequences. And the good news, I would think, is that that's likely to be very similar across maybe different types of categories. There was a question, pronounce his name correctly, Ozgi has a question about, did you take into account the fact that if I quote unquote pirate or steal a digital product, the owner may still have his or her original of that. In other words, it's not like I physically removed the one copy of the product. So in some sense, that may mitigate the sense of stealing it. It's like both of us now have it. It's not I didn't take it away from that person. So your thoughts about that?
Sure. I think that's potentially true in the case of things like movies and books and films. But we also looked at this for the case of currency, for example.
Yeah.
If I steal money, whether it's physical or digital from you, you're not going to have that. And so we see that even in the case of currency, people still show this similar effect. That's not to say that, the copy idea might add or affect the value that people see for different kinds of product categories, but we see even in these more conservative kinds of cases that when it's in the case of currency, people still show that kind of relationship.
One of the things I really liked about the whole presentation and the approach you're taking here, and you actually cited some of the authors that it goes back hundreds of years, as you know, and this is the notion that these seemingly rational economic exchanges are embedded in social networks and moral considerations that we often don't think of explicitly or when we're designing a product or service or trying to price it and so forth. And you're citing people like Jeremy Bentham and David Hume and so forth. I'm wondering, to kind of get you to speculate a bit, a lot of these psychological processes, it seems, would really apply in what it means to give or receive gifts, because the giving and or receiving is itself, transcends just the physical or digital product for that matter. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, because so much about consumerism is buying things to give to other people. So I'm wondering if you extrapolate from your work what the implications might be of this for gift giving, gift receiving, which is, part of our consumer society.
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I think a nice example of sort of that exchange is in the case of cards. So there are many services now that offer people e-cards. But think about how you would feel if your partner or your parents or a friend gave you an e-card for your birthday versus a physical card. I would suspect that you'd feel sort of more enamored with them, more happier receiving a physical than a digital card. It might seem more thoughtful or more, it might seem like more personal in that case. And I would expect that kind of difference between physical and digital goods, because gifts are sort of an expression of both the identity of the giver and also reflect the identity of the receiver, that receivers might feel like a digital gift is less personal, it less sort of touches on, it less exposes who they are, it's less meaningful than a physical gift.
That's interesting. That would sort of be my intuition as well, and I think I've seen some research that would substantiate that. Sunil wanted to clarify your point you made just now about the situation with currency. That if someone, the point being that if you take the currency away, the person, say a Bitcoin or whatever, they do not in fact have that same currency. Whereas if I pirate a movie, they may still actually have a copy of the movie. Was that the
Sure.
point you were making?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in this case, we in the piracy studies that we're doing right now, we've looked at people's perceptions of the piracy of a number of different kinds of goods. So, for example, we look at how they view the theft of digital and physical art, digital and physical books, digital and physical currency, so money, digital and physical games, so video games versus physical games, magazines, movies, music, newspapers, photographs, and tools. And so previous question had been raised about whether or not if I steal digital art, or if I steal a digital book or movie or music, does it just feel like I'm making a copy of it? I'm not depriving the owner of something that they own, right? And well, I think that's an interesting insight, and that certainly could explain some of people's justifications for why it might feel more acceptable to them. That shouldn't apply to the case of currency. So we also ask people how frequently people steal cash versus digital currency, how likely you are to get caught for the theft of cash versus digital currency, how costly is it to the owner, how morally blameworthy is it. And we find that for currency, people think that it's still more morally blameworthy to steal physical cash from someone than money out of their bank account digitally. And so whether the money's coming out of the bank in terms of a physical form, like dollars, paper dollars, or you could think about it coming out digitally, so it's just numbers coming out of their account. In this case, people feel like there's less harm done to the owner of the currency, and it's also less morally blameworthy when the theft is of digital currency than physical currency.
Okay, go ahead.
There was one interesting question. So from an anonymous attendee about, we do see that even when we account for ownership, there's still a pretty strong direct effect of physical versus digital on how much people are willing to pay. So we certainly can find that psychological ownership seems to be a strong moderator of these kinds of effects. But when we statistically control for psychological ownership, we still see that there still is variance there to be explained. So in other words, there's still other things driving this kind of effect. I think that there's a number of interesting questions that, interesting kinds of inputs that could be influencing this. So for example, you could think about norms for pricing could be one question. So even though consumers should arguably pay more for a digital book that they can access anywhere, that's weightless, that's better for the environment, that they can light up or easily bookmark and pull down from the cloud anywhere they are than a physical book. The market has set digital books to be priced lower than physical books, and so those kinds of pricing norms might influence some of these valuations. We certainly try to control for that, but it's certainly possible that that's accounting for some of this kind of difference. Or you could see that there is possible that other kinds of psychological processes are involved here that are yet to be discovered. But we think this is a really interesting field, and we hope that many more people are drawn to it and start to do research in this area.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think Oscar's comment just now is that, the invasion that would be required to steal currency, breaking into a home or pickpocketing or something, the sheer physicality of that really makes a difference. And that sort of takes us back to the endowment effect and literally the touching of the product that's involved there beyond the psychological principles. And I wanted to kind of maybe end by having you speculate a little bit about what are the implications of your work for this move towards voice interfaces with computers, AI, the Alexa and so forth, where we're going to be increasingly not even touching the technology. It's going to just sort of be there in the environment. We're going to be speaking to it. It's going to be talking back to us. How might that change some of what you've seen thus far, or do you think that is going to be that big of a change?
I think it's a great question, and a big question for a big question mark for me in that area is, how do we have consumers interact with these kinds of interfaces in a way that feels like they still have control? So you could think about a conversation with an AI or with a digital assistant as being one where there are two agents who are interacting, and they each have their own preferences, and you might ask Alexa to make some decisions on your behalf. Or there could be a case where you have a digital assistant who's going to help you execute your choices. So you feel like you're controlling this kind of this assistant who's going to go and sort of execute your will. And so an interesting question is, do people feel more control when they feel like they're instructing Alexa to act on their behalf as an agent for them, right? Or if these kinds of assistants are sort of equal partners in some kind of relationship or search. And so I think that could be a really interesting predictor in the future about whether or not people feel like they're really in control of what the digital assistant is doing, or if they've sort of relinquished control and they have less ability to influence and exert their preferences and attitudes on what the assistants are doing.
I think that's a great response, and I think very plausible too. And it does again point up to me the generality and applicability of your work, that the need for control is so important that although we could sort of engineer it out into these frictionless encounters, it may actually be optimum for most interactions to put a little bit of friction back in there, a little bit of literally or figuratively the touch in the interaction that we maybe are getting away with in the digital world. I want to thank again Carey for a great presentation, good Q&A session here, and for our audience of being with us. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar soon, and if you have additional questions, you can follow up with Carey at his email. It's morewedg@bu.edu, and we're also displaying that in the chat box on your screen. And I want to remind the audience that since 1961, nonprofit MSI has brought together the best minds in marketing from major corporations and top business schools around the world to improve business practice by applying science to marketing's biggest challenges. Thanks again to Carey and to our audience, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next Lunch and Learn webinar.
Thank you, Earl.